Hi, I'm Chris Castile with the Oklahoman and Oklahoman.com, and we are delighted to have Congresswoman Stephanie Bice back in the studio with us. Freshman Congresswoman Stephanie Bice. It's been a few months since you've been in. I think it was last fall before your election. It's been 3 months in Congress now, but it's been quite a 3 months. I mean, it seems like a very short time, but really quite a lot has happened in that 3 months. I mean, obviously started off in a pandemic. Was it 3 days after? 3 days after you were sworn in, the riots happened in the Capitol, January 6th. So it's just been, I guess you have nothing to compare this 3 months of service to from previous Congresses, but just tell me what it's been like. I mean, have you been able to establish any kind of rhythm? And because there are already all these protocols because of COVID, and now you've got all these extra layers of security, physical layers of security. Have you been able to establish any kind of rhythm in your time there? What's it been like?
It has been a challenge, and I think part of the challenge is that we're doing this in a COVID environment. And to give you a little bit of maybe example of that, when we were given instructions on swearing in, we were only allowed to have one family member with us. And a little disappointing for my family. My husband and 2 daughters wanted to all attend, but we made the family decision that the youngest got to come, which was an incredible opportunity for her. But it would have been nice to have everyone there, but because of COVID protocols, there was a limit to what we could do. We've seen some of that relaxing. When I first started going to the floor for votes, vote was taking about an hour and a half. They were staggering members to votes, and now we're down to about 45 minutes, and I think we believe that about 3/4 of the members have now been vaccinated, and so you're seeing the Speaker's office start to look at relaxing some of those really strict provisions.
What about committee meetings? I mean, are you, I know there are some that are kind of a blend where some of the members show up, but like armed services, what have those committee meetings been like?
A lot of the committee meetings are still being virtual. You can go into the committee room should you choose to, but members have also had the opportunity to participate in the meeting through Zoom or Teams meeting, and I think it's been effective. I certainly would rather be in person, and I think one of the challenges that this particular freshman class faces is that we've had a hard time getting to know people, building those relationships and coalitions, not only within the Republican side, but also on the Democrat side, and so we'll have a lot more of that, hopefully, as these pandemic restrictions ease.
Right. I mean, everybody in all walks of life, I think, are dealing with that problem, and just having in person, because it's totally different. We as we've all figured out in the last year, to try to meet virtually all the time. But I was going to ask you too about that. You talked about getting to know other members and Democrats and building coalitions and everything. There have been some media reports that there are some Democrats who don't even want to deal with any Republicans that voted not to accept the Electoral College results from some of the states that were challenged. Have you run into that at all?
I have. I was actually asked to participate in a bipartisan women's high-tech caucus. And my staff reached out to the Democrat chair to set up a meeting, and I was told that they had made a decision based on the January 6th event that I was not going to be the co-chair on that particular caucus. I also very recently was looking forward to being part of some legislation that was being put forward that was being championed by a Democrat, and I was told that I wouldn't be allowed to be a co-sponsor on the bill. So you're seeing some pretty clear lines being drawn in the sand, which is really unfortunate, because my job is to advocate for the constituents of my district regardless of what the issue may be, and that's proven to be difficult given the sort of position that many of the Democrats have taken. It's not all Democrats. There are some that have been incredibly willing and able to work with me. Great example is one of my freshman classmates, Sarah Jacobs, out of San Diego. Ideologically, we see very differently, but we both sit on the House Armed Services Committee, and there's a particular bill that we're going to be actually dropping hopefully today that deals with some military housing issues that we both believe is really important.
So has it been with these people, I mean, are they upfront with you about it? I mean, have you actually had discussions with some of the Democratic members who have these feelings, just like kind of face to face?
Some I have and some I haven't. I've tried to have some meetings with folks that have not wanted to interact. It hasn't always been successful, but I have had some meetings that I thought were really productive and helpful. I immediately after being named to the House Armed Services Committee made a point to go meet with the subcommittee chair, Representative Sherrill, to talk to her about what the focus would be for the Military Personnel Committee, and just let her ask questions and get a chance to know each other. The same thing with Adam Smith, who is the full committee chair.
Right.
I want to be able to have those relationships, and one of the nice things about Armed Services is it's a little more of a bipartisan, congenial committee,
always has been,
rather than some of the others that tend to be much more partisan.
Yeah, I mean, Armed Services is rarely, they will have partisan splits, but
sure. I think right now one of the things that we're going to be talking about, I think a lot over the next couple of months, is the National Defense Authorization Act and funding. We believe that the president's budget will indicate a cut to defense, and many of my colleagues on the Armed Services Committee do not think that that's wise, given really what we're seeing with our adversaries, including China. That cutting defense spending doesn't mean that we're not interested in advancing certain initiatives, but we've got to continue to be competitive with China, and that means investing in technology and research. And if you cut those budgets, we're going to be behind.
Right. Let me ask you about kind of the whole change in the 5th District and the way it's been, the votes from the representative. I mean, there's just been a 180-degree change in the way that you voted on some bills that are almost identical, I think, to votes that were in the previous Congress that former Congresswoman Kendra Horn voted the opposite way on: the election bill, H.R. 1, the bills on background checks, the gun bills. Trying to think of, there was an immigration bill that I think had various, a lot, it was kind of, it had the Dreamer stuff in it, but other provisions as well. People in the district may feel some kind of whiplash on, on these bills. I mean, obviously you beat Kendra Horn, but I mean, the fact that she did vote the way that she did on some of those bills, and that, I mean, it was a fairly close race, 4 points, I think. I mean, does that suggest to you that the 5th District is moderate? I mean, what's your feeling about the district? What's been the reaction to the way you've been voting on some of these bills?
Certainly I feel like that, people were very excited about my candidacy and wanted to see some different choices as it relates to some of the votes that were taken. You mentioned H.R. 1, which is this election reform initiative that the Democrats have taken on. And although people have sort of said it's to prevent voter suppression and get people engaged in the process, the one thing about that bill that no one wants to talk about on the Democrat side is the federal match for donations. Part of that legislation says that small dollar donations up to $200 to a candidate campaign will be matched by the federal government 6 to 1. So $1,200 of federal dollars, yours and mine taxpayer dollars, going to a campaign.
This is going to come from penalties levied on corporations that committed financial crimes, right?
Banks, different types of financial institutions. But the reality is it's taxpayer money.
Right.
If it wasn't going into those funds, it'd be going into the general revenue fund to help focus on help fund things like education, transportation, healthcare.
Right.
So the fact that we're now talking about taxpayer-funded campaigns is completely against everything I believe in. The other piece of that, which is interesting, is there are so many provisions in there that really make it more difficult for states to actually prevent duplicate voting. I think that once Oklahomans realized,
the Oklahoma Election Board Secretary was really against a lot
adamantly
of those,
against it, and as a matter of fact, was adamantly against it last time when Congresswoman Horn voted for it.
Right.
He wrote a letter and said that this is why this is a really bad idea. I was very fortunate when I served in the state Senate to oversee the state election board at one point fiscally. And I got to know the processes very well. And one of the things I hope Oklahomans recognize is that we have one of, if not the best election system in the entire country.
And but let me ask you about that, because there was some easing of the rules in 2020 because of all the elections I think were conducted under an emergency order from the governor. I mean, did you have any problem with more absentee ballot, kind of easier absentee balloting, or anything that went along with it? I don't think they extended early voting, did they?
They did not. But let me make a couple points, because I think
sure.
you bring up a really great point. One of the reasons that I questioned the January 6th vote was the simple fact that last year in Oklahoma, we saw ourselves facing a lawsuit by some outside organizations that in April of last year sued in the Supreme Court, challenging the notary requirement for absentee ballots, which had been on the books for 50 years and had never been an issue. All of a sudden, they claimed that COVID was sort of this burden and that we needed to do away with it. And we never, as legislators, thought that the Supreme Court would overturn it, but they did.
Right.
The end of April, beginning of May. Had we not been in session last year to actually reinstate that notary requirement with the health provision caveats that you mentioned, which means mailing in a copy of your government issued ID, mailing in a copy of your voter ID card, absentee ballots would have been allowed with no verification at all. Oklahoma is not a signature verification state, so we have no process in place for that. That's a problem. And Oklahoma has done absentee balloting the right way. You have to request it. You don't have to have a reason. Some states require you to have some reason why you need an absentee ballot. We don't do that. We've given you some parameters on how to mail in that ballot now. You have to have it in by election day. We're not going to accept it 10 days after, which is another provision.
And there was some advice too about when those need to go out, whether there's time enough, physically time enough for the post office to return it. I mean, there was some problem about that, but you're okay with the way it was done in 2020, or do you think?
I think it was done extraordinarily well, and I think the proof in that is we knew election results election night.
Right.
There were so many states across the country that they didn't know election results for days, weeks, or even months in some cases, which is what happened in New York. New York 22, you found out in February. People lose faith in the process and the election integrity when you have situations like that, which is another one of the reasons why Paul Xerox, the election board secretary, was not in favor of HR.
Let me set this off topic a little bit, but let me ask you about what you think about what's going on in Georgia. I mean, not just with the bill, but with kind of the corporate involvement in that, some of the corporate, the moving of the All-Star game out of Atlanta. I mean, what's your take on that?
It's disappointing. I think Georgians, just like Floridians back in 2000 during the hanging Chad scenario, are trying to make sure that their election processes are secure. And I actually have read some of the provisions that were included in the Georgia legislation, and they're not unreasonable. As a matter of fact, Georgia actually has more early voting days than Oklahoma does. So this narrative that voter suppression, I think part of it is just a political push. Stacey Abrams has been really vocal about her position in those issues. She ran for governor and lost, and I think there's some maybe reason that she's pushing back on these types of bills. But if your residents aren't comfortable or have faith in the process, then that presents its own set of challenges.
Well, I mean, do you feel like a lot of the outside kind of involvement in it has do you think it's been fair? I mean, do you think a lot of do you think corporations should get involved, say, in talking about some of those things?
I mean, that's their decision. But I think that in relation to the Major League Baseball relocating the All-Star game, you're only hurting your community. I don't see how that's a benefit. And furthermore, I think if people really looked at the bill and then looked at what other states have done in relation to that, maybe they'd see it differently. It's their decision.
I guess what happens, it seems like, and this isn't anything new, and this happens with issues in Congress too, where it gets hard to figure out really to get to the truth of some of these things, and you saw this a lot really on the last stimulus bill, I thought, on the $1.9 trillion stimulus bill, where the arguments being made by Democrats and Republicans were so divergent that it would have been hard for people to really know what to believe. People who weren't, just 100% partisans. For the average person to figure out who's right about this. A lot of it in the timing of when some of the money was going out. I mean, a lot of this, some of the things that are being said about unemployment benefits. I mean, how, like, when you guys are in these Republican caucus meetings, your Republican conference meetings, do you guys take a position that, this is the conference position, you have to be against this bill, whether it's H.R. 1, the election bill, or the stimulus bill, or, how much pressure do you feel to kind of vote the party line on some of this stuff?
Well, I certainly agree with many of the stances that the Republican caucus has taken. So in my case, it is a stance that I agree with, right? What I want to say, though, too, is that we're in a very interesting time in this country. You're living in a day and age where there is more transparency of government, more access to your elected officials, more visibility on what they're saying and doing. If you want to read a bill, you can go pull it up online and see it. If you want to see what your elected official said on the House floor about a specific bill, you can do that. But people are more distrusting of government than ever before. And that's a really, I think, dangerous precedent that we're setting here. And I hope that when we're talking about these bills, that we can really show both sides and why I, for example, stood against the COVID relief package. Are there people that need help? Yes, most definitely. And I think that had the bill had any Republican input at all, that it would have been better and more targeted. But one of the things that has happened since swearing in is the Democrats have a process by which they do not have to run bills through committee if they passed in the last Congress. So you mentioned H.R. 1, H.R. 5, the gun bills. Those passed last Congress, but were never heard in the Senate.
Yeah, there were no hearings on them this time.
So if they wanted to hear all of these prior to April 1st, they could, and they didn't have to go through committee. So no Republicans got any amendments. No Republicans got any, we had no debate, no discussion. And I think that's part of the challenge and why you've seen such a partisan divide with the things that we've seen over the last 2 months.
And they ran the stimulus bill through reconciliation.
That's exactly right. Again, no debate, no discussion. And reconciliation, as you know, having covered the Capitol for so many years, is normally a tool that's used to cut spending, not to increase it. And we're getting ready to see the $2 trillion infrastructure package with Biden using that same reconciliation process, which means likely no Republican input at all.
One thing I wanted to ask you about the stimulus bill. You just came from the state legislature and you were real involved in budgeting and appropriations. Does the state need another? Does the state of Oklahoma, you think, need another $2 billion? I mean, what did you think about the package of? And I know your former colleague David Holtz, who's now the mayor of Oklahoma City, is all for it. What did you think about the state and local aid piece of that?
There are certain pieces of that I know need help. For example, the Department of Education. They're getting a sizable chunk, and they've already gotten quite a bit over the last year with other packages. The challenge that education is going to face over the next, I would say, 2 years is trying to get caught up. Many of these kids are now testing at below a grade level because virtual learning is just not working for them. And we're just now seeing school districts go back to full time. So a lot of those dollars are going to be utilized for things like summer programs, after school programs, to make sure that we get kids back on track. There's some arguments to be made for that. But in a lot of other ways, I don't think those dollars were necessary. You see a lot of people receiving the $1,400 stimulus payment, right? I know folks that never lost a job and are getting, $2,800 as a couple or more with a child, that they're just putting it in the bank. Why are we as taxpayers advocating for that kind of stimulus payment when we could really be targeted about the type of help that we're doing? Here's a great example. There is a restaurant grant that's part of this latest package.
Right.
I'm all for that. There's a Save Our Stages portion of this that really helps those community theaters and venues that have been shut down for a year. I totally see the impact of that. But a blanket payment to people and money to cities and municipalities that may or may not need it, you're just increasing the national debt and putting it on the backs of our future generations.
So you mentioned the infrastructure bill, which is next, and I haven't heard that they're definitely going to do it reconciliation process. I mean, I guess that's maybe a possibility, but it includes this tax increase piece too. I mean, what's your feeling? I mean, obviously, when you were in the legislature in 2018, Republicans passed a tax hike then, much of which went onto the oil and gas industry. So you're not 100% opposed to tax increases, I guess, and this one would be on corporations. But what's your feeling about this tax hike?
Well, the gross production tax issue was a completely different scenario from my perspective, because there was a delineation between virtual drillers and horizontal drillers paying completely different rates, and sort of that fight. This issue is going to be a big one, because it is not just corporations. It is individuals, it is estate tax, it is death tax. I mean, we're talking about a pretty broad array of tax increases. And what I would remind people is that this isn't just a corporate tax increase from 21 to 28%. Many small businesses will see the impact of it. And it's sort of surprising to me that you would see someone like Jeff Bezos with Amazon advocating for a 28% tax hike, or a tax hike to 28%, when Amazon is paying an effective tax rate of 8%.
So, and I was going to ask you about that. I mean, you just talked about kind of trying to equalize the taxation between disparate sorts of drilling, production from that drilling. There are stories every year about companies, these international, multinational corporations who pay next to nothing and have an effective tax rate of next to nothing in the United States after so many, quote, tax reform bills. It just keeps happening. What would you do about that? I mean, I know that there's got to be, you don't want to use the word loophole, but there have to be ways that companies are using these provisions in the tax code to pay less than much smaller companies are paying.
And look, I think Congress has passed all of these, right? And we have to really look at how it impacts all that tax structure as a whole. My concern is that you're doing all of these things at a time when the economy is still fragile, when we're still seeing states battle unemployment, we're still seeing a decline in revenue. Oklahoma has been very fortunate that we're seeing low unemployment, revenues up, partially because of oil and gas, and so we're not having to see that impact. But when you're looking at a small mom and pop, let's say a plumbing company that's now going to have to increase their tax rates by 7% or more, that's going to put a huge burden on them, and this is not the time for that. Do I believe that infrastructure is vitally important? You bet. But there are so many pieces of the $2 trillion infrastructure bill that have nothing to do with traditional transportation.
Right.
They are not focused on roads and bridges. They are not focused on water infrastructure. It's housing, meeting DOD 100% green initiatives, things that I think are very unnecessary at this time. The other thing I would tell you is that we are looking at this package, and President Biden has said, well, it'll raise I think it's $2.5 trillion over 15 years. Well, we're going to spend $2.3 trillion right now. You're putting us way behind the 8 ball, and that doesn't include the $6 trillion that we've spent in COVID relief over the last year.
Well, let me ask you this real quick on the redefining of infrastructure, which is kind of the topic du jour. I mean, you would conclude broadband in that, I guess, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it goes beyond just building roads and bridges.
Yeah, broadband, and especially rural broadband, is a huge issue. Certainly it was highlighted because of COVID, and you saw the disparity in areas that didn't have access to the internet, whether it was school districts or residential that really needed that, whether they were working from home or trying to teach kids from home. We do need to look at that. One of the things, though, that's really exciting is you're seeing some new innovative technologies come down the pipeline that can address that. Some of the great space companies are looking at ways to actually use satellite in a very different way to be able to provide broadband to communities at a very high rate of speed. 5G is being implemented in places that will allow for high-speed internet in communities. So these initiatives certainly are something that we need to be looking at as we move forward.
Well, there at least is an acknowledgement, it seems like now, coming from the administration, that in order to keep spending the kind of money that's been spent in the past year, that there may need to be increases in revenue if you're going to spend it. I mean, do you see the need, just even given what Congress spent even before you got there, to raise more revenue?
I want to see what all the numbers look like, and I'm a little early into my tenure to be able to understand, how much in debt we are and where we could make that up. One of the things I did learn very quickly, though, is the discretionary spending of Congress on an annual basis is about $1.3 trillion. And we've just spent $1.9 trillion on the most recent COVID relief package.
Yeah, a lot of the previous deficits were entitlement based,
That's
really.
right.
I mean, a lot of people didn't understand that it wasn't.
Medicare,
and
Social Security, those
yeah.
are the real big initiatives. You could cut defense spending to zero, not that I'm advocating for that at all, but you could do that and you still wouldn't be able to make up the difference. And so I think that's the thing I hope Oklahomans understand, is that this makes a difficult balancing act when we're talking about COVID relief or transportation that we're going to be paying for decades.
And the president came out today with some announcements that he was going to take some executive actions on guns that kind of around the edges stuff. I mean, obviously it's none of the topics that Congress has addressed in recent years on background checks or on types of weapons that might be banned. You obviously, in your primary and in the general election, stressed that you were opposed to any kind of gun control. We've had more incidents, more mass shootings. Is there any kind of bill that you would vote for? I mean, I think most Republicans, if not every Republican, voted against the background check bill this time, right?
I don't remember specific numbers,
so
but
I mean, what is the flaw in expanding background checks to sales that don't require background checks? Now, I mean, if you're going to require it for some, what's
so here's
wrong with
here's sort of the interesting dynamic, is that the Democrats are saying that this will cut down on what they consider mass shootings, which is four or more people in an incident, right? But if you look at all of the incidents that have happened over the last several years, virtually none of them would have been impacted by the provisions or the laws that they're trying to implement. Mental health services is one that I've talked about for quite some time. I want to be talking more about how can we ensure that we're providing enough resources for folks so that they don't turn to an alternative like using a firearm to take people's lives.
Right. Well, in red flag laws are one of the things that I guess, where are you on that?
They're looking at. They're going to look at those, and we can certainly have a conversation. But I think you have to be very careful about that, because at what point do you take someone's rights away, constitutional rights away, and do they ever get them back? And I think that's the danger in a lot of these discussions, is that people are untrusting of, if you take away my right, am I ever going to have the ability to get it back? If you are
well, all rights come with limits. We know that. And the Supreme Court, in both of its decisions, I think, in the last decade or 15 years, however, since the Heller decision, they've said that we're not saying that you can't have these restrictions on. They never said that background checks. They never said you couldn't ban guns within a certain distance from schools or anything like that. They're kind of leaving it up to. And you can tell in the cases that they haven't taken since those two decisions that they're sort of leaving it up to
states
or local governments, because some cities have bans on certain kinds of weapons. So it's not. That's kind of a judgment that you're making, that it's taken away somebody's constitutional rights to have a background check on them or something, because the Supreme Court has never said that.
No. But what I'm suggesting is that you're taking away their constitutional right on a red flag law, because there's no provisions in place as to when they get it back.
But on a background check, I mean, that's not necessarily a Second Amendment issue, is it? I mean,
I would argue that you could make it one, but I think the issue here is that the Democrats are making an argument that more background checks is going to prevent some of the gun violence that we're seeing, and I'm not sure that there's a correlation there.
Okay. Do you have any kind of immediate reaction to Biden's proposals today? I mean,
I haven't read through all of them. It's happened early
These
this
are just
morning, and I saw it, and that was really about it.
They're executive orders, so it's not like. Let me ask you real quick too about the situation at the border. The Border Patrol came out with numbers today saying that some of the ones that they're rejecting, the attempts are at like a high in the last 3 or 4 decades. Really, what from administration to administration, this is a problem. I mean, nobody would say that this is something new that's happened since Biden became president. It existed, when Trump was president, when Obama was president, when Bush. I mean, it goes back. Is there any common ground? I mean, you've had any discussions among lawmakers of your own party, say, to come up with some kind of broad? I mean, it's really up to a lot of people think it's really time for Congress to do something that ends this.
Well, so I think
some kind of path forward.
Sure. So there's 2 issues here, right? Okay. There's the border and securing the border, and then there's the immigration discussion.
Right.
And you mentioned the DREAM Act earlier. You can't offer amnesty to folks in one bill and then not protect the border in the other. I think you have to sort of address both of those. And I think if we're going to secure the border and then we want to have a conversation about immigration reform, that makes a lot of sense to me. But in the absence of that, what we've done is we've seen the Biden administration effectively open the border with the executive orders that he signed very early on, not negotiating with these Central American countries that are sending people north. The catch and release, doing away with that provision that President Trump had put into place. These actions, I think, were a sign to people the border's open. And when you have 19,000 unaccompanied minors coming across the border last month, that is really troubling.
So is a wall going to do it? I mean, is that really?
I'm open to any conversation. A wall, technology. We certainly need more border patrol.
Well, what about the argument that he's making about Trump putting an end to this funding aid in these Central American countries where the desperation is just so high?
It's a great question. Do you know how much we have given to the 3 Central American countries in the last 6 years? Over $3.5 billion to very poor, very small countries. And I did the math. I'm not a math expert, but that's $167 million a year.
Do you think it's being siphoned off somewhere?
This is the question, right? You're talking about El Salvador, Guatemala, and I think it's Nicaragua is the Northern Triangle is what they call it. I could be wrong about the third. But the point is, $3.5 billion hasn't stemmed the flow of people north. What are we doing? How do we address that? That's the issue.
Right. You guys have been doing a flurry of votes there for a while. I mean, what does the next this summer look like? You start doing spending bills. I think one of the big arguments is going to be the Hyde Amendment in every spending bill, or a lot of the spending bills that come through, HHS, defense, maybe even. That they're going to do away with the Hyde Amendment. Is that still kind of what's expected? And the Hyde Amendment prohibits public funding to be used on abortion.
That's correct. I haven't heard anyone talk about the Hyde Amendment actually in any of these bills. What I do know is that my focus right now is the NDAA, National Defense Authorization Act. That's coming up. We'll be working on putting that together and likely a vote in June or July. Then we're also starting to work on the appropriations piece, which is funding, and that'll last through early fall. That's really, I think, the focus right now. And then for me, learning the process. It is truly drinking from a fire hose, and I'm really blessed that I have some perspective of how things are on the state level, and I can utilize that to advocate for Oklahoma.
Do you have any feel for when you'll be able to do a town hall, like get out and? What's your
Well, so we did a telephone town hall, I think it was last week, and our hope is that maybe late summer, early fall, we'll be able to start doing some in-person town halls.
Are you looking forward to that? I mean, other than, how are you keeping in touch with your district?
We have done lots of outreach. I think in the last, especially since I've been home in district, there's a lot of outreach going on. I have an incredible staff. They are boots on the ground every day. I spent all day today going around the district to speak to community leaders and business owners to find out what their concerns are, and that's going to be my focus.
Thanks so much for coming in. It's good to see you, and I really appreciate you taking the time.
You bet.
Thanks for watching, and look for more on Congresswoman Bice and the rest of the delegation in the Oklahoman and the Oklahoman.com.